If you're looking to Dan McCLellan to help you become a better Bible interpreter, there's something about his work that you have to understand. In a nutshell, my case is that Dan McCLellan is not ultimately or primarily an interpreter. Now, that's not an evaluative comment. It's not to say trust him or don't trust him. It is simply to say if you take a hard-nosed hermeneutical look at his work, hermeneutics is the art of good interpretation, you'll come to the conclusion that he's not primarily an interpreter at all. And that's totally fine as long as you understand it. Now, if you say to me, listen, not everything in this world has to be interpretive, I would disagree with you, and here's why. There's literally nothing in your life, in this world, in this universe, on this planet, nothing, no reality that is not communicative, that you do not relate to if you're exposed to it, and that therefore you have to interpret nothing. Even when you're asleep, your brain is active, sorting through the experiences of the day. Anything your senses perceive, any thoughts that you have, they are all communicative. You cannot pick and choose. Might as well get good at it. So it really does matter. Anyway, let's play a clip.
Every last person who treats the Bible as an authoritative text picks and chooses because there's no other option. And this is not to say there's anything wrong with picking and choosing in and of itself. It is to point out that you either pick and choose or you do not treat the Bible as an authoritative text.
The first clue that Dan McCLellan does not think primarily as an interpreter is that in this very clip he confuses issues of authority with issues of interpretation, and he mixes them together as if they were the same thing or two sides of the coin, and they are not. Interpretation is about conceptual relationality, and it falls in the domain of the author, the obvious reason being that it's the author who created the thing to be interpreted. Now we have to differentiate between empirical authors and implied authors, but I'll say more about that later. Assigning authority, on the other hand, is a matter of evaluation, and that falls in the domain of the interpreter. Epistemologically, the two are completely distinct from each other. It is entirely possible, and even a daily occurrence, that you interpret something well and then you assign authority to that something. By the same token, you may misinterpret something knowingly or not and still assign authority to it. In other words, they are not the same thing. By the same token, you may get the locution of a text right, the basic utterance, and then assign authority to that or not, but you get the illocution or the perlocution wrong, that is the energy of the text, and still you may assign authority or not. Those are separate matters. Now, when Dan talks about picking and choosing, he's not wrong, but that's an interpretive matter. And why in the world he connects that to issues of authority assigned to the text or not, that beats me. On what basis does he do that? What is being gained by doing that? What's being gained by that in his mind is that the road is now open to attacking certain fundamentalisms, and I'm with him on that, but you cannot allow that to usurp the very notion of interpretation. One more thing before we move on. When Dan talks about the Bible as an authoritative or non-authoritative text, why doesn't he talk about the Bible as a collection of texts, plural, instead? Because that is what it is. And once again, I have to conclude that he doesn't really think about this as an interpreter.
Because texts don't have inherent meaning. The Bible does not have inherent meaning. It must be interpreted.
So here's why my last comment matters. He just said that texts don't have inherent meaning. The Bible does not have inherent meaning. So what does he mean by saying inherent meaning? What he means is that meaning still needs to be interpreted. I just don't understand why he would see interpretation in opposition to inherent meaning. You can most certainly have inherent meaning, and that meaning still has to be interpreted. And once again, it's a false dichotomy, isn't it? I have a strong suspicion that the reason he gets himself into trouble here is because he does not work with the notion of implied author versus empirical author. Everything he seems to say about authors is focused on the empirical author, so he will tell you that such and such did not really write this, even though the text says so, and so on. And he may or may not be right on that, but that's not the issue. The question of inherent meaning has nothing to do with the empirical author, except that in the past the empirical author created an implied author. It's ultimately about the meaning of the implied author. That is where we have to interpret. Now, Dan clearly does not operate with that distinction, even though we should. Now, you put on top of that the fact that he's really into debunking ideas about the empirical author. So, for instance, he would always err on the side of dating stuff later. He would always err on the side of saying this wasn't written by the person it was claimed to have been written by, and so on. Those are not interpretive questions at all. If we want to interpret, we have to go after the implied author, not the empirical. The empirical one is the one who brought about the implied author, but it's the implied author who's the holder of inherent meaning. And the reason is simply that the implied author is actually a function of the text in a way that the empirical author never can be. Even though Dan ends up denying the very notion of inherent meaning because he does not make this differentiation. By the way, these different concepts that I'm introducing here, implied versus empirical, illocution, perlocution, and so on, these are well known and established in literary studies, but for some reason theologians are pretty much unaware of it, and Dan is no exception on that front.
In other words, meaning is generated as the text is engaged by a reader, a listener, or a viewer who brings a set of social, historical, and rhetorical circumstances with them to create the interpretive lenses that allow them to generate that meaning.
There's something here that he's not wrong about, and there's something that is very wrong about. The piece that he gets right is that, of course, every interpreter brings with him or her all kinds of context, all sorts of historical circumstances, exigencies, as he calls them, and so on. Of course, that's obvious. We know that. But where he is quite wrong is in the first part of this clip. And he talks about the reader or the interpreter having to generate meaning. The reader doesn't generate meaning. The reader tries to get into the mind of the implied audience. Now, some of you are going to freak out at this point, and you're going to point out that it's impossible for a human to get inside the mind of another human. But the mistake you're making at that point is that you're still thinking empirical author, much like Dan usually does, when in fact what we need to do is get in the minds of the implied author, and we simply call that interpretation. It's as simple as that. You know the times when as humans we say things like, I didn't mean to say that, or I didn't express myself well. Right there you have the difference between the empirical author who didn't express him or herself well and the implied author, which is what was actually being said. There's a difference between the two. Where do we go for interpretation? The empirical author and the empirical author's mind, or the implied author's mind? And the answer is, of course, the latter. By the way, if I say implied author, implied audience, it doesn't really matter which of the two, because they're perfectly complementary in their relationship. They're a theoretical notion, and the whole point of using this implied language is to say they match each other. Example, if I speak to you as a teacher, I make you my implied learner, and vice versa. And those roles can change in conversations, because each time an empirical author speaks to the other, they adjust. When people have an argument, for instance, those two roles change the whole time, even though the empirical actors don't change. The implied audience is the perfect counterpart to the implied author, and to figure out that relationship is what interpretation is all about. Back to the clip I played a minute ago. In that first part, he assigns the role of generating meaning to the reader or interpreter, whereas originally it was the role of the empirical author, right? For some reason, he has no respect anymore for the empirical author, and obviously that's not personal disrespect, it's postmodern hermeneutical disrespect. And people often point out, well, the empirical author isn't available to us. That misses the point. In the old days, we used to say that. That was a mistake. But the empirical author created an implied author, which is a theoretical notion, and the implied author is embodied in the text. And the implied author is very much accessible to us. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. But that is where meaning lies. The empirical author bequeathed to us an implied author-audience partnership, and to get into that, that is the role of the interpreter. The role of the interpreter is not to generate meaning. The role of the interpreter is to recover or reconstruct meaning that's embodied in the implied author-audience partnership. By the way, empirically, I'm not a car mechanic, but I can certainly speak to you as a car mechanic. In that case, the car mechanic is the implied author, even though empirically I'm not. Do you see the difference? Same thing goes for the audience. If we don't work with those basic categories, we end up in a position like Dan is, where we basically say meaning can't be generated by the empirical author, or if it was, we just disregard it, and instead we bring the meaning to the text. It's like bringing food to someone else's picnic and hijacking it.
And usually the received tradition, in combination with the rhetorical goals, the exigencies, are going to exercise the most authority. The text itself is really just the rubber stamp for whatever meaning those other factors generate.
Wait, what? The text is just a rubber stamp for whatever meaning those other factors, whatever they are, generate? Are you serious? So now we've completely replaced the text with those other factors? So even by his own words, he's obviously not an interpreter anymore at this point, right? The interpreter is at this point essentially the purveyor of these other factors. Screw the text, basically. In my hermeneutical teaching, I refer to the kind of thing that Dan does, and to postmodern hermeneutics in general, as a case of reauthoring. By that I mean not reinterpretation. There's no such thing, only if you misunderstand the notion of interpretation. What I mean by reauthoring is you take someone else's text, you turn it into shrapnel, you build something new out of it, so you're the new author, but you still continue to pretend that you're an interpreter, which you're not. And all because Dan ignores these basic factors of implied versus empirical, speech act. So, for instance, locution, illocution, perlocution, narrative meaning, and all the rest of it. We need hermeneutics. If we don't, we end up in this pit. By the way, have you ever noticed, and I say this partly in defense of Dan, there is hardly anywhere a commentary to be found, a scholarly commentary that understands this stuff, or a study Bible. You go there and all they do is talk about the empirical stuff. None of that is helpful for interpretation unless we make it helpful, and we cannot make it helpful if we don't work with the notion of implied author audience.
On one end of this spectrum, you're picking and choosing so as to make the text most meaningful and useful to you in those circumstances. On the other end of that spectrum, you're picking and choosing in order to try to figure out what would have made the text most meaningful and useful to the author, the editors, and the earliest audiences.
So he sketches two extremes and he says nothing about the middle, and yet interpretation happens precisely in the middle. Meaning you bring your own background as an interpreter. Yes, you're subjective. We are subjective human beings. But on the other hand, you want to treat the text with respect. Even if the text ends up being fishy or sketchy or awful or horrendous or whatever, you would only know that if you interpret the text on its own terms first. And then the question of authority can come in, but that's post-interpretive. Once you fall off that horse, you're in trouble. It doesn't matter which side you fell off. Did you notice, by the way, how he snuck editors in there? He referred to the author and the editors. But here's the thing. Once you have an editor working on the text, you end up with a new text, and an interpreter will appreciate that. Hermeneutically speaking, editors are like new authors. They took the work from previous authors and they reinvested, and in so doing, they create a new text.
The closer we are to trying to make the text more meaningful and useful to us, and the more dogmatic we're going to be.
Yes, that is clearly correct.
If we're closer to the how did this text operate on its own terms, how is it meaningful and useful to its authors, editors, and earliest audiences, the more we have to overrule making the text meaningful and useful to us.
No, you don't have to overrule. Once you take the notion of implied audience seriously, as opposed to the empirical audience, to whom we have no access and we don't need them, once you take the role of the implied audience seriously, that is your interpretive option. You're giving the text a chance to become relevant to you, whether you like it or not, whether you later assign authority to it or not. That isn't the issue. The issue is you give the text a chance. You don't overrule it. But if you apply Dan's hermeneutic, all you can do is overrule the text, which is a violent act, frankly.
Across the entire spectrum, we're always picking and choosing. We have no other alternatives. The more we're going to have to overrule our own intuitions and our own desires to find specific meaning in the text.
No, we don't have to overrule our own intuitions either. We just have to be aware of them. Everything seems either or. Everything is like a false dichotomy here.
You can either pick and choose, or you can lie to yourself about the fact that you're picking and choosing.
So right at the end of this video, he says we all pick and choose. Basically, we all interpret. And that, of course, is true. My question is Dan actually acting and thinking like an interpreter? And I have my serious doubts about that. Dan ignores these basic factors of implied versus empirical, speech act. So, for instance, locution, illocution, perlocution, narrative meaning, and all the rest of it. We need hermeneutics. If we don't, we end up in this pit. So here are my closing thoughts on the matter. You can be as progressive as you want. If you do not have a solid hermeneutic that underpins it all, you're going to end up in a position of reverse fundamentalism, and wouldn't that be a crying shame? By the way, I do not know if it's true that Dan is still a member of the LDS or Mormon Church, but if he is, my last point about reverse fundamentalism would possibly make sense of that, wouldn't it? If you're interested in these things and you want to become a better interpreter, have a look at my store. The link's in my profile. In there, you find, in the store that is, you find a course called The Narrative Experience, and it's all about this kind of thing and how to make this count practically in actual biblical interpretation or any kind of interpretation. I've had many lawyers over the years who told me that this should have been taught at law school. They're baffled why it's not. If you want, by the way, I can put on a free 1-hour webinar on this. Just let me know. Anyway, the narrative experience in the link in the profile.